Caroline Brooks was a 36-year-old veteran who thought the worst battles of her life had already been fought. But one frozen night in the Helena National Forest, her German Shepherd Ranger began to claw at the ground, until Caroline uncovered a nightmare she could never have imagined. Buried, half alive, bound in ropes, and left gasping in the cold earth was Detective James Callahan, and with his last breath he whispered a truth that shattered Caroline's world. Her husband Michael had not died in an accident. He had been murdered. What happened next could break your heart and heal it at the same time. But first, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Type your country in the comments. Winter in Helena, Montana, had a way of swallowing sound. The city sat in a valley wrapped by the northern Rockies, its lights faint against the vastness of snow-covered peaks. Outside the limits, where the Helena National Forest spread its arms, silence reigned except for the crunch of boots on ice and the whisper of wind through frozen pines. Caroline Brooks inhaled deeply, her breath blooming into the air in pale clouds. She tugged her parka tighter across her shoulders, the olive-green fabric dulled by wear. At 36, she carried herself with the quiet discipline of a woman who had lived two lives. One as a staff sergeant in Iraq, hardened under desert suns, and another as a widow in Montana, hardened under the colder weight of loss. 3 years had passed since Michael, her husband, her anchor, had died in what authorities called an accident. 3 years, yet the ache never softened. She had chosen solitude over sympathy. Now her days belonged to Ranger, her 5-year-old German Shepherd. The dog trotted at her side through the snow, his sable and black coat catching the dim light, his amber eyes sharp and searching. He was her shadow, her sentinel, the only creature who demanded her presence in the world. The forest that night felt especially still. Above, the last blush of sunset faded into bruised purple, stars just beginning to prick the sky. Caroline adjusted her rucksack, listening to the creak of leather straps, the crunch of snow. Ranger halted suddenly. His ears rose, tail stiff, body locked. A growl rumbled low in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Caroline's hand brushed instinctively to the knife at her thigh. Ranger stepped forward, nose close to the ground. His body quivered with alertness, the way soldiers did when they smelled danger in the air. He pawed at a patch of earth near the base of a pine. Caroline frowned. The snow there looked wrong. It was lumpy, uneven, as though it had been pushed back in a hurry. Ranger began to dig, claws tearing through the frozen crust. Clods of dirt and ice flew behind him. The growl deepened into frantic barks. Caroline crouched, brushing snow aside with her gloves. At first it was only soil. Then something pale broke through. Her stomach lurched. A hand. Human. The skin was raw around the wrist, mottled with bruises. Thick rope cut deep into the flesh. "Oh, God," Caroline muttered. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, old battlefield instincts flooding back. She clawed faster, her gloves slick with melting frost. Ranger whined sharply, digging with her, their movements frantic, synchronized. The earth gave way to a face. Male. Mud smeared across his cheeks, lips blue from cold. His eyelids twitched beneath clumps of soil, but his chest rose barely beneath the weight of the ground. Caroline's breath caught. He was alive. She scraped more dirt from his mouth, gasping when he released a faint groan. His body was twisted, forced into the shallow grave half on his back, half sideways, as though discarded like trash. His ankles were bound tight with the same rope as his wrists. The man's shirt, once a crisp button-down, was torn, exposing skin marbled with bruises. His coat, black and heavy, had been ripped at the seams. A badge gleamed faintly from his belt clip, dulled by soil but still visible under the glow of Caroline's flashlight. Detective James Callahan. Caroline knew the name. Helena wasn't New York or Los Angeles. It was a city where names traveled, where police officers were neighbors, soccer coaches, churchgoers. James Callahan was 40, a veteran detective with a reputation for digging too deep into places others avoided. Now he lay bound beneath her, breath rattling like broken glass. Caroline's throat tightened. She pressed 2 fingers against his neck. A pulse throbbed faintly, fragile but present. Relief surged through her chest. James's lips parted. A hoarse whisper escaped, too weak to form words. Dirt clung to his teeth. His head tilted slightly toward her, eyes flickering half open. Caroline leaned closer, trying to catch his voice, but the wind gusted, rattling the branches overhead, swallowing the sound. Ranger barked again, spinning toward the tree line as if aware of unseen eyes. The forest was quiet, too quiet, as though holding its secrets in clenched fists. Caroline stared down at the man in the dirt, snow stinging her cheeks. A detective, half buried, left to die. Who had put him here? Why this patch of wilderness? And why did she feel, in the pit of her stomach, that this discovery was only the beginning of something darker? Her breath trembled. She wanted to drag him out, to cut the ropes, to force life back into his body, but at that moment, all she could do was kneel there, staring at the horror Ranger had uncovered. James Callahan's chest rose shallowly, his eyes slipping closed again, as if each breath might be his last. Caroline's fingers clenched into fists. Whatever nightmare she had stumbled into, it had just begun. The snow kept falling, silent and merciless, covering the half-buried man as though the earth itself wanted him hidden. Ranger growled low and steady at her side, a guardian daring the shadows to move closer, and Caroline Brooks realized she was staring at a grave that was never meant to be found. The snow continued to drift from the canopy above, silent and relentless, dusting Caroline's hair and settling on Ranger's fur. For a long moment she knelt over the half-buried detective, pulse racing with the disbelief that he still clung to life. His lips were bluish, his chest struggling against the weight of earth and rope. She realized hesitation would kill him faster than the cold. Caroline ripped the knife from her belt. The blade glinted in the narrow beam of her flashlight as she worked furiously at the ropes binding his wrists. The cords were rough hemp, stiffened with frost, and bit deep into his flesh. She saw where the fibers had carved bloody grooves into his skin. With every cut, James Callahan's body twitched weakly, as though even the loosening bonds sent shocks of pain through his battered form. Ranger pressed his body close to Caroline's side, his ears flat, his growl constant. The dog's gaze swept the tree line, nostrils flaring. Caroline trusted that Look Ranger was more than a companion. He was her early warning system, tuned to every tremor in the night. Finally, the last cord snapped. She tugged James's arms free, then bent to slice through the knots binding his ankles. When she dragged away the last of the soil covering his chest, James coughed violently, expelling dirt from his mouth. The sound was raw, jagged, and it echoed through the frozen forest like a plea. Caroline eased his head onto her lap, removing her gloves so she could feel his skin directly. It was ice cold, the pulse beneath his jaw erratic. "Stay with me," she ordered, voice firm, the same tone she had once used for soldiers under her command. "You're not done here." Not tonight. His eyelids fluttered. He was a man in his early 40s, with a face carved by lines of fatigue and duty. His dark hair, peppered with gray, clung damp against his forehead. His coat was the standard issue of the Helena Police Department dark wool, badge clipped at the hip, but it had been ripped at the shoulder, the lining torn as though someone had dragged him across the ground. Caroline noted details automatically, the way she had trained herself to do in war, condition of the victim, signs of struggle, possible perpetrators. James's lips moved, but at first nothing came. Caroline leaned closer, catching the faint tremor of his voice. "Ambush. They came out of nowhere. Masks, all of them." His throat rasped like gravel. "I'd been looking into something old. I thought I could finally close it. I was wrong." His hand twitched upward, weakly gripping her sleeve. Caroline steadied him, confusion threading with fear. "Who did this? Why bury you here?" His eyes rolled slightly, searching for hers, and then focused with startling clarity despite his frailty. "Your husband." The words scraped out of him like broken glass. "Michael Brooks." It wasn't an accident. The world seemed to tilt. The falling snow blurred. Her breath caught midair. For 3 years, she had lived with the official story that Michael's brakes had failed on an icy road, sending him into a ravine. She had replayed it endlessly, trying to accept fate, convincing herself it was random tragedy. Now, a stranger, half dead and buried alive, was telling her it had been no accident. Her throat closed. "What did you say?" James coughed, a fleck of blood dark against the snow, but his grip tightened. "They killed him. The same people who tried to bury me." His voice cracked and his head lolled back against her arm, eyelids heavy. Caroline's eyes stung. Tears slipped down her cheeks, mixing with the snow that melted on her skin. Rage and grief tangled in her chest, a storm stronger than the one falling around her. She pressed her forehead briefly against the detective's temple, whispering, "No, no, not Michael." Ranger whined low beside her, nosing against her shoulder as if sensing her unraveling. The dog's growl deepened again, warning against the darkness surrounding them, but also pressing closer to her body in an almost human gesture of comfort. Caroline forced herself upright, dragging air into her lungs. She had seen death. She had carried men home under fire, but this was different. This was personal. A scar she thought time had closed now ripped wide again. She wiped her face roughly with the back of her glove, looking down at James Callahan. He had given her more in those rasped whispers than 3 years of silence ever had. But now he was slipping, consciousness fraying at the edges. She shook him gently. "Stay awake." "Tell me who they are. Who killed Michael?" His eyes fluttered, breath rattling. "Names. In my notes. Not safe here." His words faded into incoherence, his body sagging heavier against her. Caroline clenched her jaw, staring into the empty night beyond the beam of her flashlight. Somewhere out there were men who had thought they had silenced James Callahan, the same men who had stolen Michael from her. Somewhere out there danger waited, possibly even watching them now. She gathered herself, holding James steady against her knees. His breathing was shallow, but still there. Ranger stood sentinel, body taut, fur bristling, amber eyes locked on the unseen. The truth had cracked open like ice beneath her boots, and the abyss beneath was darker than she could have feared. For now, there was nothing more to do but keep James alive, cling to his whispered revelation, and face the night with the soldier's resolve she thought she had buried with Michael. The forest closed in, the snow falling heavier, and Caroline Brooks knew her world had changed forever. The drive back to Hauser Lake was a blur of snow and shadows. Caroline's pickup truck rattled down the narrow forest road, its tires crunching through drifts, headlights barely slicing the darkness. In the back seat, Detective James Callahan slumped against the window, wrapped in Caroline's spare field blanket, his breath shallow but steadier than before. Ranger sat pressed against him, head lifted, ears sharp, as if daring the night itself to make another move. Caroline gripped the wheel, eyes fixed on the winding road ahead. Hauser Lake was only 20 minutes from Helena, but tonight it felt like another world remote, cold, unforgiving. Her cabin stood on its northern shore, a modest timber structure with a wood stove and creaking porch, the sort of place built for retreat rather than company. It had been her refuge ever since Michael's death, a place to drown the memories she couldn't bury. By the time she pulled into the cabin's clearing, the snow was falling heavier, muffling the tires and coating the roof in white. She cut the engine, opened her door, and the silence of Montana swallowed her again. James stirred when she opened the rear door. Up close, his face looked even harsher beneath the dome light. The lines at his eyes carved deeper by pain, his lips cracked, dirt still crusted in the corners. She had to half carry him into the cabin, Ranger pacing beside them with restless energy. Inside, the warmth of the wood stove hit immediately, though the fire had burned low. Caroline eased James onto a worn leather couch, then stoked the embers back to life. The flickering flames painted the room in amber light. Shelves lined with old military manuals, Michael's framed photographs of mountain trails, a folded flag displayed in glass. The sight twisted Caroline's chest until she forced herself to look away. She crouched beside James, peeling away the layers of mud-stiffened clothing. His shirt was torn across the ribs, and when she touched gently, he winced. Bruises darkened his torso, some fresh, others older, layered like a record of weeks spent in quiet battles. She cleaned the cuts with antiseptic, wrapped his wrists where the rope had bitten deep. James's eyes flickered open, the flames reflecting in them. His voice was rough, low. "You didn't have to bring me here." Caroline met his gaze firmly. "If I'd left you in the woods, you'd be dead." "That's not an option." He tried a faint smile, then coughed. When the fit passed, his voice grew steadier. "I suppose you deserve the truth." More than anyone, Caroline froze, cloth stilling in her hands. She braced herself. James shifted slightly, pulling the blanket tighter across his chest. 3 years ago, Michael wasn't just unlucky on an icy road, he was targeted. He'd come to me with files, bank ledgers, wire transfers, proof that a company called Frontier Energy was laundering money through shell operations. It was risky, but he thought exposing it could clean up the city. Caroline's heart stuttered. Michael. His name sounded like both balm and blade when spoken aloud. James's eyes held hers. Frontier Energy is run by Charles Whitmore, a man in his 60s, billionaire, philanthropist on paper, monster beneath it. He's built an empire in energy contracts, but behind the glass towers there's bribery, fraud, worse. Michael stumbled onto it by accident. He'd found a ledger when helping a client at his old firm. He brought it to me. Caroline's throat tightened. Michael had been an accountant, methodical, meticulous. She could picture him hunched over his laptop at their kitchen table, frowning at columns of numbers, unable to ignore when they didn't add up. James looked away, his jaw flexing. A week after he gave me the files, he was gone. His car wrecked off Route 12. The report said faulty brakes. I never believed it. But by then, the files had vanished. Someone inside the department buried it. The words settled heavy in the small cabin. Caroline's hands clenched the rag until her knuckles whitened. For years she had lived with suspicion, the itch that something was wrong, yet without proof she had swallowed it. Now here was James, confirming every fear she had locked away. Her eyes burned. "And you?" "I kept digging," James admitted. "Quietly. Too quietly, I thought. But Whitmore has eyes everywhere. When I got close again, they came. Masks, gloves, the whole deal. They beat me, trussed me up, and tried to make sure I'd never open my mouth." He swallowed hard, a shadow crossing his face. "They thought no one would find me." Caroline sat back on her heels, staring at the flickering fire. The scar inside her had been torn open, but beneath the pain burned something stronger. Rage, sharp and cold. She had spent 3 years burying Michael twice, once in the ground and once in her silence. That ended tonight. Ranger growled softly, padding to the front window. His body stiffened, ears pricked. Caroline followed his gaze. Through the frosted glass she caught the faintest impression, a shadow moving beyond the tree line, too fluid to be the wind. Her stomach clenched. James noticed her stillness. "What is it?" She rose, crossing to the window with deliberate steps. Ranger pressed his nose to the pane, tail stiff. Outside, the snow was thick, but for a moment she swore she saw a figure, dark, indistinct, watching from the tree line. Then it was gone. Caroline lowered the curtain, jaw tight. "We're not alone." James shifted on the couch, grimacing. "They'll finish what they started." Caroline turned back to him, her voice cold with resolve. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Ranger barked once, sharp, as if sealing the vow. The cabin fell into tense silence, the only sounds the crackling stove and the storm outside. The scar had never closed, and now it bled openly again. But Caroline Brooks no longer feared its pain. She embraced it, because within it lay the truth and the fight she had been waiting for. The cabin walls creaked under the weight of the storm, but Caroline knew the sound outside was not just the wind. Ranger's growl had grown deeper, his body rigid by the window, amber eyes fixed on the tree line. Caroline extinguished the lantern with a swift motion, plunging the cabin into shadows lit only by the wood stove's fading glow. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She recognized the silence before an ambush, the breath held just before the strike. She slipped her knife back into its sheath and reached beneath the couch for a long black case. Snapping it open revealed a hunting rifle, not military issue but sturdy and reliable. She had not touched it in months, not since the lonely hunting trips that had kept her sane, but her hands knew the weight, the balance, the ritual. She chambered around softly, then turned to James. The detective stirred on the couch, wrapped in the blanket, his face pale but alert now. His lips moved weakly. "They're here. To finish it." Caroline crouched beside him. "Can you move?" James shook his head faintly. His voice cracked but carried urgency. "I'll slow you down." She set her jaw. "We're not leaving you behind." Ranger suddenly barked, sharp and explosive, spinning toward the door. The handle rattled. A shadow crossed the frosted window pane. Then the crack of wood splintering echoed as the front door shuddered against a kick. Caroline sprang to her feet, rifle raised. She glimpsed movement. Men in dark winter jackets, hoods pulled tight, faces masked by balaclavas. Their figures loomed in the snow, weapons glinting in the moonlight. The door burst inward. The first intruder stumbled through and was met by 80 pounds of fury. Ranger launched forward, teeth sinking into the man's arm. The attacker screamed, weapon clattering onto the wooden floor. The sudden chaos shattered the stillness. Caroline fired once through the doorway. The shot rang like thunder, and another shadow dropped into the snow. She grabbed James, pulling his arm around her shoulder. "Move now!" The back door led to the forest. She half-dragged, half-carried James through the narrow kitchen, shoving the door open into a whirl of snow. Ranger disengaged from his victim and bolted after them, blood flecking his muzzle, eyes blazing. The forest swallowed them immediately, branches heavy with snow bowing low. Caroline pushed forward, her boots crunching deep drifts, the detective's weight dragging against her side. She moved with the same precision that had once guided patrols in Iraq. Head low, steps measured, ears tuned to every shift in the dark. Behind them, shouts rose from the cabin, beams of flashlights stabbing through the night. James groaned, teeth gritted. "You should have left me." Caroline cut him off with a whisper. "I don't abandon people." Ever. They pressed deeper into the trees, the cold biting, their breaths clouds of desperation. Ranger ranged ahead, nose cutting through the wind, then circled back, guiding them toward the thicker cover. His instincts were impeccable. A shot cracked from behind, the bullet thudding into bark inches from Caroline's head. She ducked, forcing James down with her into the snow. Ranger snarled, lunging toward the noise before Caroline hissed, "Stay!" The dog froze, trembling with fury, but obeyed. Caroline scanned the shadows. 3 men advanced between the trees, rifles in hand. Their leader moved with calm precision, not like a thug, but a professional. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his parka stretched over body armor. A black mask hid his face, but his bearing screamed training. He raised a hand, signaling the others to flank. Caroline recognized the tactic instantly. Whoever Whitmore had sent, they weren't amateurs. She pressed James against a fallen log. "Stay down. Don't make a sound." Then she slipped sideways into the trees, rifle ready, heart steady. The soldier in her surfaced fully now, the widow's grief fueling her resolve. She circled low, stalking one of the flankers. The snow muffled her steps. When he passed within yards, she rose, swung the butt of her rifle, and struck him squarely at the base of the skull. He dropped into the snow without a sound. She yanked his weapon away, slinging it across her back. Another intruder's flashlight swept dangerously close. Caroline flattened herself behind a tree, breath shallow. Ranger crouched beside James, eyes locked on her, waiting for her signal. She exhaled slowly, raised her rifle, and fired. The second man fell into the drifts, his light extinguished. Shouts erupted. The leader barked orders, voice muffled but commanding. Caroline pulled back, using the trees for cover, her body recalling every ambush she had ever survived. James forced himself up slightly, eyes wide with disbelief. He saw not just a widow anymore, but a soldier, cold, deliberate, unbreakable. Caroline returned to him, pulling his arm once more across her shoulders. "We need distance." Now Ranger darted ahead, then froze, ears pricked. A faint path curved toward a ravine she knew well. It would take them deeper, harder to follow. She trusted the dog's sense more than her memory. The leader cursed in the darkness, realizing his team was faltering. Caroline didn't look back. She pushed forward, every step fueled by fury and survival, dragging James through the snow, Ranger clearing the path like a scout. The storm thickened, curtain-like, cloaking them in white. Flashlights flickered far behind, shouts fading. Caroline knew it wasn't over, but for the moment they had slipped the noose. They collapsed in a hollow beneath a cluster of pines, snow forming a natural shelter. Caroline lowered James against the trunk, his face pale, his body trembling. She crouched beside him, scanning the forest. Ranger pressed close, his growl still steady, his body a wall of loyalty. The night held its breath again. The cabin was gone, enemies behind them, the wilderness ahead. Caroline's chest heaved, but her eyes burned with fire. She had defended her husband's memory long in silence. Tonight, silence was broken. The hollow beneath the pines offered only temporary shelter. Caroline knew that staying meant death, and moving meant risk. But in the end, the decision wasn't hers, it was Ranger's. The shepherd paced in circles, ears swiveling toward every distant crack and crunch, then pressed his nose insistently against Caroline's arm, urging her forward. She glanced down at James Callahan, his face gaunt, lips pale but his eyes still burning with stubborn fire. "We can't stay here," she murmured. "There's only one place left to go." By dawn, they had reached the outskirts of Helena, slipping quietly along back roads before merging onto I-15 South. Caroline's pickup rattled across the icy asphalt, its old heater struggling to keep the windshield clear. James sat slouched in the passenger seat, swaddled in blankets, each bump in the road forcing a wince across his face. Ranger sat upright between them, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he understood the gravity of their journey. Billings lay 200 miles east, a city larger than Helena, but still a place where people noticed outsiders. More importantly, it housed someone Caroline knew only by reputation but trusted by instinct. Special Agent Laura Martinez of the FBI. Laura Martinez was 42, second-generation Mexican-American, raised in El Paso by a schoolteacher mother and a father who had worked the Border Patrol. She had risen through the bureau with quiet tenacity, earning a reputation for pursuing corruption cases that others conveniently ignored. Caroline had never met her personally, but James had spoken her name once, years ago, as the only person in federal law enforcement who hadn't bent to Whitmore's money. The drive stretched long and tense, the radio left silent, the landscape unfolding in endless plains dusted with snow. James dozed intermittently, his breathing shallow, but when he stirred, his voice came unguarded, worn thin by pain. "I should have gone to Laura sooner," he muttered. "I thought I could handle it alone. Thought if I kept it small, maybe Whitmore wouldn't notice. Stupid." Caroline kept her eyes on the road. "You're alive. That's more than they planned for you. Don't waste what's left beating yourself up." He gave a faint chuckle, then fell quiet. For miles, only the hum of the tires filled the cab. Then James turned his head, studying her profile. "You're stronger than I expected." She didn't look at him. "Grief will either break you or forge you. I didn't get to choose," which his gaze softened. He hesitated before speaking again. "I never told anyone this, but there was someone, before all this spiraled out of control, a woman, Emily Carter. She's a doctor, works at St. Vincent's Hospital in Billings. Brilliant. Kind. The kind of person who makes you believe you could have a life outside the job. His fingers clenched the blanket. But when I started digging into Whitmore, I ended it. Better she hate me than end up in a grave. Caroline glanced at him finally. His confession was raw, tinged with regret that clung heavier than his injuries. You pushed her away to protect her. James gave a bitter smile. That's what I told myself. Still, don't know if it was courage or cowardice. Caroline's chest tightened. In his story, she heard an echo of her own. Michael hadn't pushed her away, but fate, or Whitmore's hand, had torn them apart all the same. Sitting in that cab, driving through the desolate Montana winter, Caroline realized she and James were tethered by scars of different shapes but equal weight. By late afternoon, the skyline of Billings appeared, modest towers rising against the snowy plains. Caroline pulled into a side street near the Federal Building, parking in the shadow of a stone church. She cut the engine. "This is it," James whispered. They made their way inside through a service entrance, Ranger padding silently at their heels. The Federal Building's corridors smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. At the far end of a narrow hallway, a woman in a navy pantsuit stepped out of an office, a file tucked under her arm. Laura Martinez's presence commanded the space without a word. She was tall, her hair black and streaked with silver pulled into a no-nonsense bun. Her dark eyes scanned instantly, sharp but not unkind. She wore a wool coat over her suit, boots practical against the winter streets. Years in the bureau had etched a calm authority into her features, but there was also something steady, human, a reminder of the teacher-mother who had raised her. James managed a weak smile. "Laura, I bet you thought I was dead." Her brows lifted. She strode forward, taking in his battered state. "You look like hell, Callahan." Then her gaze shifted to Caroline, assessing, weighing. "And you brought a soldier with you." Smart Caroline straightened, instinctively formal. "Caroline Brooks." Army veteran. Widow. She hesitated on the last word, but Laura only nodded, as if the whole truth was already written across her face. Laura ushered them quickly into her office, closing the blinds with a decisive tug. Files stacked neatly on her desk told the story of a woman who fought battles through paper trails and evidence rather than guns. But the Glock, holstered discreetly under her blazer, said she was not naive about what her enemies could do. James collapsed into a chair. His voice rasped. "It's Whitmore." "He tried to bury me, literally. Caroline saved me." Laura's jaw tightened. "Whitmore. I've been circling him for years. Frontier Energy's books reek, but every time we get close, someone higher up pulls the plug. Bribes, threats. It's like chasing smoke." Caroline folded her arms. "Then we need fire." Proof that can't be ignored. Laura studied her, eyes narrowing slightly. "You've lost someone to him, too." Caroline nodded once. "My husband. Michael Brooks, 3 years ago? Car crash, they called. An accident. James says otherwise." For the first time, Laura's expression faltered. She lowered herself into her chair, setting the file aside. "Then you understand what's at stake." The three of them sat in tense silence, the storm outside rattling against the windows. Ranger lay at Caroline's feet, his head on his paws, but his eyes remained locked on the door as if sensing that even here, safety was an illusion. Laura leaned forward, voice low. "I can't promise you justice overnight. Whitmore has men everywhere, even in law enforcement. But if you've survived this far, then maybe together we can finally cut through the smoke." Caroline felt James's eyes on her. For the first time in years, she did not feel alone in her fight. Laura Martinez locked the office door behind them, pulling the blinds tight until the gray light of Billings faded into narrow slats. The hum of the Federal Building continued beyond the walls, phones ringing, footsteps echoing. But inside her office, the air thickened with secrecy. She moved to a tall steel cabinet, tugged a keyring from her belt, and opened the drawer with a metallic snap. Caroline stood near the desk, arms crossed, her body still stiff from the long drive. James Callahan sat hunched in a chair, fatigue etched deep into the lines of his face. Ranger rested at Caroline's boots, ears flicking at every sound, his body taut but calm, the steady presence that anchored her through every storm. Laura laid a thick folder onto the desk, its red, confidential stamp catching the light. Her expression was carved from stone. "This isn't supposed to exist outside bureau walls," she said quietly, "but if you're going to fight Whitmore, you need to see what we've got. And you need to understand just how dangerous he is." She flipped the folder open. Inside were photographs, grainy surveillance shots of Charles Whitmore, 63 years old, tall with silver hair, always combed immaculate, eyes sharp beneath tailored suits. He moved through boardrooms, charity galas, golf courses, surrounded by allies in expensive coats. On paper, he was the model of philanthropy donations to hospitals, scholarships for underprivileged students, but the photographs painted a colder picture. Men in tactical gear entering warehouses at night, armored trucks loading unmarked crates, cash changing hands behind closed doors. Laura set down a small digital recorder. She pressed play. The sound crackled, distorted, but the voice was unmistakable, smooth, cultured, dripping with disdain. "Brooks is a problem. He saw more than he should have. Handle it. I don't care how. Just make sure it looks like an accident." The voice chuckled faintly, then cut off. Caroline's knees went weak. She gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white, as though the wood was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. The room tilted. For years, she had clung to hope that maybe her suspicions were wrong, that maybe Michael's death had been the cruel work of fate, but the tape erased any doubt. It was Whitmore's voice, cold, casual, ordering her husband's murder as if he were discarding trash. Her breath hitched. In an instant, she was no longer in Laura's office, but back in her kitchen 3 winters ago, clutching the phone while a police officer's voice on the other end said the words that shattered her world. "Accident. No survivors. I'm sorry, Mrs. Brooks." She remembered falling against the counter, remembered Ranger whining softly as he pressed against her legs. She remembered staring at Michael's coat still hanging by the door, waiting for him to walk back in. Tears blurred her vision now, but she refused to let them fall. She forced her breath into steady rhythm, the way she had on convoys under fire. She looked at Laura with burning eyes. "This is proof." Laura shook her head grimly. "Something. But Whitmore's lawyers will call it fabricated, call it hearsay. Unless we can connect him to the financials and the violence, it won't be enough in court." James's voice rasped from his chair. "That's why they came after me." I was getting close to linking the payments. His body sagged, but his jaw clenched. "They buried Michael. They nearly buried me. If we don't act, they'll keep burying others." Caroline turned her gaze to the window, watching snowflakes smear against the glass. Rage smoldered under her ribs. She had buried her grief for 3 years, but now it returned as fuel. Ranger rose to his feet suddenly, padding toward the office door. His nose pressed to the crack beneath, ears twitching. A low growl vibrated in his chest. Laura frowned. She moved quickly to the peephole, her hand brushing her Glock. Outside, 2 junior agents strolled by, their laughter muffled. They glanced curiously at the door, likely startled by the sound of Ranger's growl. Laura exhaled softly. "He doesn't miss a thing, does he?" Caroline stroked the shepherd's head, pride flickering through her grief. "He sees more than most people." "Always has," the agents outside whispered, then moved along. Ranger relaxed fractionally but stayed seated, gaze still locked on the door as though daring anyone to intrude. Laura leaned back against her desk, crossing her arms. "Your dog may be smarter than half my team. He's earned his place in this investigation." James managed a faint grin through his exhaustion. "Smarter than me some days." Caroline finally let herself sit, sinking into a chair beside James. Her chest felt raw, scraped open by the recording. But beneath the pain, something else grew. Purpose. For the first time since Michael's death, she knew exactly where to direct her fury. Laura closed the folder with a decisive snap. Whitmore thinks he's untouchable. He isn't. But this will take more than courage. It'll take strategy, patience, and allies who won't sell out. Her gaze swept between Caroline and James. If you're in, there's no turning back. Caroline met her eyes steadily, her voice like steel. I was in the moment. He killed my husband. The office fell into silence, broken only by the crackle of the building's ancient heating system. Ranger lay across the doorway now, head on his paws, golden eyes watchful. He looked like a sentry guarding not just the office, but Caroline's fragile heart. In the flickering fluorescent light, the shadows had finally revealed their shape. The enemy had a name, a voice, and Caroline Brooks no longer carried her grief alone. The storm outside Billings had eased, leaving streets glazed with ice, their lamps glowing faintly through the haze. In Laura Martinez's office, the atmosphere was heavier than the Montana winter itself. The folder with Whitmore's name sat closed on the desk, but its weight lingered in the room like a loaded weapon. Laura leaned forward, elbows on the desk, eyes sharp beneath the glow of the overhead light. We can't wait for him to make the next move. He has the power, the money, and the silence of half this state in his pocket. We need him to show his hand in public, and we need him cornered when he does. Caroline sat opposite, her parka still damp from the snow. Her jaw tightened, eyes steady. Then we set a trap. James shifted uncomfortably in the chair beside her. His body was still battered, his face pale under the fluorescent light, but his voice carried the stubborn grit of a man who had been buried alive and survived. Easier said than done. Whitmore isn't reckless. He doesn't show up anywhere without layers of shields between him and the world. Laura's gaze flicked to him. That's why you nearly died, because you got too close. He prefers shadows. We have to drag him into the open. Silence stretched. Then Caroline spoke, voice low, deliberate. He wants me. He won't stop until I'm gone, just like Michael. If we make it seem like I'm digging where I shouldn't, if we put me in plain sight, he'll bite. James's head snapped toward her, his eyes flashing. No, absolutely not. He already took one Brooks. I won't let him. His voice broke, ragged from emotion and exhaustion. Caroline didn't flinch. I'm not asking for permission. I'm offering what he already wants, a target. The room grew taut with unspoken fears. Ranger lifted his head from the floor, sensing the tension, his golden eyes darting between them. Laura broke the silence. It could work. If Whitmore believes you're about to expose him, he'll send his men. If we control the environment, we can catch them in the act. It won't be enough to put him in prison yet, but it will unravel his shield. James slumped back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His voice cracked when he spoke again. There's something else. He hesitated, then finally forced the words out. Emily Carter. She's a doctor here in Billings. She doesn't know it, but she's on their radar. Whitmore's men have been following her for weeks, probably because of me. I walked away from her years ago to keep her safe, and now I've dragged her into this anyway. Caroline studied him quietly. She had seen men confess sins on battlefields, when mortality stripped away pride. This was no different. James's features were lined with regret, the admission almost harder than the wounds still marking his body. Laura pulled a pen from her desk, scribbling Emily Carter's name onto a notepad. Tell me everything about her. James nodded faintly. She's 38. Works long hours at St. Vincent's Hospital. Blonde hair, usually tied back, blue scrubs, practical to the bone. She grew up here in Montana, stayed to serve her community. She deserves better than being dragged into this. Caroline leaned forward. Then we make her part of the plan. If they're watching her, we use that. She becomes the signal that Whitmore's watching us. James's fists clenched. I won't put her in danger. Laura's tone was steady but firm. She's already in danger, James. The only difference is whether she knows it. The detective's shoulders sagged. He looked at Caroline, then at Ranger, who had padded closer and pressed his head against Caroline's knee. For a moment, James seemed to see them both clearly. Soldier, widow, dog-bound together by loss and loyalty. His voice softened. He won't hesitate to kill again. Caroline met his gaze. Her voice carried no tremor, only steel. Neither will I, if it means stopping him. Laura closed the folder with finality. Then it's decided. We'll set the stage. Caroline becomes the bait. Emily's presence confirms their surveillance, and when Whitmore's men make a move, we'll be waiting. The plan was reckless. It was dangerous. But in that office, with shadows pressing at every window and memories clawing at every heart, it was the only path forward. Ranger growled softly, as though he, too, understood. Downtown Denver shimmered with winter lights, the streets alive with limousines and black sedans dropping their passengers at the entrance of the Grand Sheraton Hotel. Its marble facade glowed golden under chandeliers suspended over the porte-cochere, while valet attendants in crisp uniforms rushed to open car doors and usher in guests dressed in tuxedos and sequined gowns. Inside the ballroom, the air buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses and the hum of a string quartet. Waiters in black vests carried trays of champagne, weaving between tables adorned with crystal centerpieces. The occasion was billed as the Frontier Energy Winter Benefit Gala, raising money for children's hospitals. But beneath the glittering chandeliers, the true purpose was networking. Powerful men reinforcing one another's wealth and influence. Caroline Brooks adjusted the floor-length navy gown Laura had chosen for her, her soldier's posture impossible to disguise despite the elegance of the dress. Her hair, normally tied back in practical braids, had been curled and let down to soften her sharp edges. She moved with poise, but her eyes never rested. Every reflective surface became a vantage point, every cluster of men in suits a potential threat. At her side, Ranger wore a black harness marked Service Dog, blending into the background of polished heels and leather shoes. His eyes scanned constantly, tail still, the calm tension of a predator leashed. James Callahan accompanied them, transformed by a borrowed tuxedo. The bruises on his face were hidden beneath careful makeup, though the stiffness in his movement betrayed lingering pain. His role tonight was clear: stay near, guide Caroline to Whitmore, and keep his eyes open for Emily Carter, who was expected to attend as part of the hospital delegation. Special Agent Laura Martinez was also present, disguised among the guests. She wore a midnight green gown, hair pinned in a sleek twist, but beneath the glamour her Glock was hidden in a thigh holster. She had blended into political fundraisers before, but never one with stakes this personal. Her task was to coordinate surveillance from within and pass signals to the outside FBI team staged in vans around the block. Then came the man of the hour. Charles Whitmore, 63, entered the ballroom with his wife clinging to his arm, her diamonds flashing beneath the chandelier. Whitmore's silver hair gleamed, his smile weighed and practiced. He wore a tailored tuxedo that cost more than most families' yearly wages, his bearing calm, his eyes sharp with arrogance. Guests clustered to greet him, hands outstretched, voices eager. Caroline's chest tightened at the sight of him. This was the man who had given the order. She had heard his voice on tape, and yet here he stood, smiling, praised, untouchable. Ranger leaned gently against her leg, grounding her in the storm rising inside. James whispered, "This is it. We stay close, record everything, and pray he slips." Caroline and James mingled into the crowd. A waiter brushed by, and Caroline discreetly pressed a tiny recording device under the lip of a marble column near the stage. Laura passed a similar device to a sympathetic staff member, a junior agent in disguise, who placed it under the head table. Whitmore eventually took the stage, tapping the microphone. His speech began as expected. Heartfelt thanks to donors, a parade of statistics about children's health, a carefully rehearsed humility. Cameras flashed as guests applauded, but it was afterward, during a private moment, that his mask slipped. Caroline and James, weaving through the throng, drew near enough to hear Whitmore in hushed conversation with the senator. His words were casual, laced with contempt. Obstacles come and go. Brooks was one of them, too curious, too righteous. He learned the hard way that accidents happen when you cross me. Caroline's heart slammed. The recorder near the column blinked faintly, capturing every syllable. James squeezed her arm. "We've got it." But before relief could sink in, danger erupted. Ranger stiffened, his ears pricked, his body coiled, muscles taut. In the reflection of a mirrored pillar, Caroline caught sight of a man across the ballroom balcony. He was dressed like hotel staff in a black vest, but his hand moved too quickly, too deliberately, pulling a suppressed pistol from beneath the tray he carried. The muzzle lifted, pointed toward Caroline. Time slowed. Ranger lunged, his bark shattering the refined quiet of the gala. He crashed into Caroline's hip, forcing her to stumble aside just as the shot rang out. The bullet whistled past, shattering a champagne flute on the table behind her. Chaos erupted. Guests screamed, ducking beneath tables. The string quartet scattered, violins clattering to the floor. Whitmore's polished mask faltered as he was hurried toward the exit by his security detail. Caroline hit the ground, rolling behind a table, her dress tearing at the seam. James dove beside her, grimacing in pain but drawing a small concealed handgun from his jacket. Ranger snarled, teeth bared, eyes fixed on the balcony. The shooter tried to aim again, but the dog was faster. Ranger bolted across the floor, leaping onto the staircase and tearing upward with terrifying speed. The crowd gasped as the German Shepherd hit the balcony rail, teeth sinking into the gunman's arm. The pistol clattered to the carpet. Laura was already moving, her heels discarded as she sprinted with an agent's precision. She slammed the gunman into the wall, cuffs snapping around his wrists in a motion so fast it was almost invisible. "FBI!" she barked, her voice echoing through the ballroom. The guests were frozen, stunned by the spectacle. Cameras continued to flash, capturing Ranger's bared teeth and Whitmore's retreating figure. Caroline stood shakily, her heart hammering. She had nearly been executed in front of 1,000 witnesses, but instead, they now had proof of Whitmore's arrogance and a failed assassination attempt in public view. James steadied her, his hand gripping her elbow. His voice was rough but certain. He just exposed himself, and the world sawed it. Caroline glanced toward Ranger, who still held the would-be killer pinned, his growl low and steady. She stroked his fur, whispering, "Good boy." The trap had sprung. Whitmore had been forced into the open, and now there was no going back. The morning after the Denver Gala, headlines screamed with photos of chaos: a shattered champagne glass, a toppled table, the German Shepherd mid-leap toward a masked gunman. Whitmore's name wasn't yet on the front page, but the whispers in political circles told him enough. He had been recorded. He had been seen, and his empire was starting to crack. By the time the FBI issued a warrant, Whitmore had already vanished. His private jet was grounded in Colorado by federal order, but his convoy of black SUVs tore northward through the frozen highways, cutting into the wilderness of the Beartooth Mountains, near the border of Montana and Wyoming. There, nestled among peaks and forests, he owned a sprawling estate fortified like a fortress. The storm followed him. By nightfall, snow slashed sideways in brutal sheets, reducing visibility to a few feet. Winds screamed through the passes, rattling bare branches and burying roads in minutes. But the FBI was not far behind. Special Agent Laura Martinez took command from the passenger seat of a lead bureau vehicle. Her face was pale from lack of sleep, but her voice carried the same authority that had brought her through 2 decades of corruption cases. She wore a tactical jacket over her evening gown. There had been no time to change after the gala, now hidden beneath body armor. Into her radio she snapped, "Teams Bravo and Delta, hold the southern flank. We're pressing up Route 212. Whitmore's not getting past us." In the back seat, Caroline Brooks tightened her grip on the rifle resting across her knees. Her parka was zipped to her chin, her hair pinned beneath a wool cap, but her eyes burned with purpose. Ranger sat on the floorboard beside her, restless, muscles quivering with anticipation. James Callahan rode in the next vehicle, flanked by 2 agents. His tuxedo from the gala was torn, replaced by a bureau-issue parka, but he still looked battered cheeks hollow, bruises dark against his skin. He had insisted on coming despite Laura's protest. He killed Michael. He tried to kill me. I'm not staying behind. The convoy wound higher into the mountains. Snow hammered the windshields, tires spun against the drifts. Ahead, Whitmore's SUVs struggled up the pass, engines roaring. When the first shots cracked through the blizzard, the FBI vehicles skidded to a halt. Whitmore's men, clad in white camouflage parkas, had positioned themselves along the ridges, rifles trained on the road. Bullets sparked against steel, carving into snowbanks. "Out!" Laura barked. "Move! Move!" Caroline leapt into the storm, snow crunching beneath her boots. She hauled Ranger close, unclipped his harness. "Find them, boy," she whispered, and the dog darted forward, his dark coat vanishing into the white. James stumbled out of his vehicle, pistol raised. He crouched behind a boulder, firing at flashes of muzzle light. An agent beside him, a young man named Cooper, barely 30, with freckles visible beneath his helmet, returned fire. Cooper had grown up in Bozeman, Montana, working ranches before joining the Bureau. Now his jaw clenched with fear and determination as he fought to hold the line. Caroline sprinted across the road, snow slicing her face, rifle snapping against her shoulder. She dropped one of Whitmore's guards with a single shot, then dove into cover. Ranger lunged from the storm, knocking another gunman off his feet, teeth flashing. Then Caroline heard the cry. She turned to see James stagger from behind the boulder, his parka torn crimson at the shoulder. He collapsed into the snow, weapon slipping from his hand. Cooper grabbed him, dragging him into cover as bullets chewed into the ground around them. "James!" Caroline dashed to him, sliding into the snow by his side. Blood pulsed from the wound, soaking through the parka. His face twisted with pain, but his eyes found hers. "Don't stop. Go after him," he rasped. "Not without you," she shot back, tearing open her kit. She pressed gauze into the wound, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline. The storm screamed around them, but her world narrowed to this single moment. Keep him alive. Ranger returned, muzzle bloodied, and stood guard, growling at the shadows beyond the drifts. Caroline tightened the bandage, cinching it until James hissed. "You'll live," she muttered. "I've patched worse." But the firefight raged. Whitmore's convoy was already climbing toward the estate gates, engines roaring through the storm. His guards pressed harder, buying him time. Laura appeared beside them, snow whipping her hair loose from its bun. "We need to push forward now. He's minutes from the estate." Caroline looked at James, pale but conscious, then back at Laura. "Then we finish this." She turned to Ranger, pointing toward the nearest guard. "Go!" The shepherd launched forward, his body a blur against the snow. He slammed into the gunman, dragging him down into the drifts. Caroline followed, rifle barking, each shot deliberate. Within minutes, the ridge fell silent. Whitmore's guards lay scattered, subdued or retreating, but his SUVs had vanished into the blizzard, swallowed by the mountain. Caroline knelt beside James once more, her gloves slick with his blood, snow settling on her shoulders. His breath came ragged, but his hand found hers, gripping weakly. "Don't let it end like this," he whispered. Caroline met his eyes, voice steady as steel. "It won't." "Not for you. Not for Michael." Behind them, Laura's radio crackled with updates, agents rallying, regrouping for the final push. The storm howled, the mountain loomed, and Whitmore's shadow stretched deeper into the blizzard. But Caroline Brooks, with Ranger at her side and James still alive beneath her hands, refused to let him disappear. The Beartooth Mountains were merciless that night. Wind clawed through the pines and howled across the ridges, driving snow sideways until it seemed the entire world was nothing but white chaos. Beyond the storm, the dark shape of Charles Whitmore's estate loomed, stone walls, iron gates, a mansion rising against the wilderness like a fortress built to defy the world. FBI vehicles skidded to a halt in the courtyard, tires buried in drifts. Agents poured out, rifles raised, pushing through the gale toward the grand double doors. Caroline Brooks was among them, her parka coated in frost, rifle gripped with unshaking resolve. At her side, Ranger pressed forward, ears flat, growl vibrating low in his chest. Behind her, James Callahan leaned heavily against Agent Cooper, blood seeping through the fresh bandage on his shoulder, his face pale but his eyes burning. Special Agent Laura Martinez strode ahead, her hair whipped loose by the wind, commands sharp over the comms. They broke into the mansion with a crash of boots and shouted warnings. Inside, the world shifted from storm to opulence, crystal chandeliers glittering above, rugs muffling steps, portraits of Whitmore in gold frames lining the walls. The air smelled of cigars and polish, an empire of wealth built on blood. Whitmore stood at the far end of the great hall. He was still in his tuxedo from the gala, though the bow tie now hung loose at his throat. His silver hair gleamed in the lamplight, his expression caught between arrogance and fury. Around him, the last of his private guards aimed weapons at the intruders, but their stances faltered under the FBI's advance. Laura's voice cut through the tension. "Charles Whitmore! FBI! Drop your weapon and surrender!" Whitmore's eyes locked on Caroline. Recognition flared. He sneered, his voice booming across the hall. "You, the soldier's widow, you should have stayed in the shadows. Your husband did not understand how the world works, and neither do you." Caroline raised her rifle, her voice steady. "Michael understood justice. That's why you killed him." The words broke something in Whitmore. His polished mask slipped, rage twisting his features. He raised his arms, shouting into the storm of cameras and microphones the agents had set live. "Yes, I ordered it." Brooks stuck his nose where it didn't belong. He had to be removed, just like Callahan, just like anyone who thinks they can defy me. The hall seemed to freeze. Every word had been caught by the Bureau's recorders and streamed to the media link Laura's team had activated. Somewhere far beyond these walls, journalists, prosecutors, and the public were hearing the confession in real time. Whitmore realized too late what he had done. His eyes darted, wild, then fell back on Caroline. With a roar, he reached for the pistol hidden inside his tuxedo jacket. "Caroline!" James shouted hoarsely. But Ranger was already moving. The German shepherd launched forward with a snarl, crossing the marble in a blur of muscle and fur. His jaws clamped down on Whitmore's wrist just as the pistol cleared the fabric. The gun clattered across the floor, harmless. Whitmore screamed, stumbling backward under the dog's weight. Caroline surged forward, kicking the weapon farther away. She brought Whitmore to the ground, her knee pinning his chest, her rifle pressed firmly against his collarbone. The storm outside battered the walls, but inside the hall the silence was broken only by his ragged breaths and Ranger's low growl vibrating against his flesh. Laura advanced, cuffs ready. "Charles Whitmore, you are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, racketeering, and obstruction of justice." The billionaire's empire ended not with a negotiation, but with the snap of steel cuffs around his wrists. Weeks later, the headlines told a different story. Whitmore sentenced to life without parole. His empire collapsed under federal seizure, his allies scattered. The man who had considered himself untouchable now lived behind bars, stripped of wealth and power. James Callahan spent those weeks recovering in St. Vincent's Hospital. His shoulder wound healed slowly, but the fire in his spirit burned brighter than ever. Caroline visited daily, sometimes with Ranger curled at the foot of his bed, sometimes in silence, sometimes with shared memories of Michael that stitched their grief into solidarity. Emily Carter eventually walked back into James's life. The doctor had known fear since learning she was under surveillance, but she carried herself with quiet strength. 38 years old, blonde hair tied in a loose knot, scrubs still creased from long shifts, she embodied the calm resilience of those who healed while others fought. When she entered James's room, his voice broke. "Emily." "I never stopped." She silenced him with a hand on his uninjured shoulder. "I know." Caroline watched them from the doorway. Ranger pressed against her leg and felt something she hadn't in years. Peace. Spring melted the snow from the hills of Montana when the new foundation launched. On the shore of Hauser Lake, Caroline, James, Emily, Laura, and dozens of community members gathered for the dedication of the Michael Brooks Justice Fund. Its mission, to protect whistleblowers, to support families who dared to stand against corruption, to give voice to those silenced by power. Caroline stood at the podium, her hair swept back by the lake breeze, her hand resting lightly on Ranger's harness. "My husband believed the truth matters, even when it costs everything. Today, we honor him not with grief, but with action. This is for him, and for everyone who refuses to be afraid." Applause rolled across the gathering. James, arms still bound in a sling, stood beside Emily, who smiled through tears. Laura Martinez clapped from the front row, pride flickering in her sharp gaze. Ranger sat at attention, chest broad, the living emblem of loyalty and courage. In that moment, Caroline no longer felt like a widow defined by loss. She felt like part of something larger, a family forged from broken pieces, stitched together by justice, love, and the unwavering bond of a dog who had never left her side. The storm had passed. The scar remained, but in its place, light broke through. Sometimes miracles do not come with thunder or lightning. Sometimes they arrive in the form of courage that refuses to break, in the loyalty of a faithful dog, or in the quiet strength of people who choose justice over fear. Caroline's journey reminds us that even in the darkest storms, God can turn pain into purpose and loss into healing. In our everyday lives, we may not face billionaires or blizzards, but we do face choices, whether to stay silent or to stand for what is right, whether to give up or to trust that God is still writing a greater ending. If he could carry Caroline, James, and Ranger through their trial, he can carry us through ours too. If this story touched your heart, please share it so others may find hope as well. Leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith and courage, and join us in praying for everyone still waiting for their miracle. And if you believe that God still works wonders in this world, write Amen in the comments below. May the Lord bless and keep every one of you who watches.